You're listening to the live coverage of the Alaska Federation of Natives Convention. I'm your host, Bob Petersen, and joining me from KMBA, Tripp Crouse, and independent producer Emily Schwing. It's been a busy couple days here at AFN. Let's bring you up to date on what's been happening.
Right. Yeah, it's been a very busy week. We had Elders and Youth first until Wednesday. We had a meeting of the National Congress of American Indians on Wednesday, and now here we are on the second day of AFN. We did manage to catch up with Tara Sweeney, Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, both at the National Congress of American Indians meeting on Wednesday here in Fairbanks, and then again yesterday. And she was here to talk about a lot of issues. We did manage to ask her about climate change, resource development, and land conservation, but we also talked to her about public safety and abuse and murdered and missing Indigenous people, and that seems to have been it made up a major portion of the discussion all of yesterday afternoon into this morning, and even when we walk around here on the floor, we're hearing it.
One of the reasons that's so important is it brings visibility to an invisible culture that we feel that the Native Americans, Native Alaskans have been for so long. And now we're trying to raise awareness to that fact. And so you had a moment to talk with Tara?
I actually talked to her yesterday. I talked to Tara after she spoke the main stage here at AFN. And I was asking the question, and my immediate gut question was talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And she was quick to correct me on that.
When you hear me talking about missing and murdered, it will be missing and murdered Native Americans because MMIW represents a segment of our community. And as we began this process of engaging Indian country and Alaska Native communities, I was reminded that it's not only women who are victims, it is our children and our men. And it's not only Indian country, but Alaska Native communities and Native Hawaiians. And so when I talk about the missing and murdered epidemic in our communities, it will be under the umbrella of Native Americans.
That's a very important distinction to make, and I'm glad that Tara was able to point that out.
And something that's not in that clip, too, she was really quick to talk about the designation of Indian country, but when she's talking about missing and murdered Indigenous people, she's talking about Alaska Natives as well and Native Hawaiians.
Absolutely. Just engaging stuff.
And it really stands out to me, we've all been covering AFN for many years, and it just seems like the volume on this conversation about murdered and missing Indigenous people, sexual abuse and violence, misconduct, public safety, that knob just gets turned up a little bit more every year. There were years that we never heard this kind of stuff spoken about openly on the floor and then also on the stage by leadership. But where I believe this really broke open was in 2013 when we were here in Fairbanks, and 7 kids from Tanana, a small interior village, stood on the same stage we're looking at now and got up and talked about, what was going on in their village. And we actually have tape from 2013.
I'm here to help those who hurt like I hurt. Male, female, young, old, gay, or straight. We all hurt. No more. I'm not here because I hate my family. I love my family to the moon and back. That's why I'm here. Here for the future of my little cousins and my children I'll have in the future. Break the silence. No more violence, emotional, mental, or physical. Rape and molestation stops today.
This visibility of these terrible things that are happening to our youth, to our women, to all people is something which has been taboo to talk about in the past. And on the day one of AFN in the afternoon session, it was brought up, no more. We need to have a higher accountability and the ability to call out problematic behavior while not shutting out the individual, because that's one of the cultural items, is like we cannot dismiss an individual and because they're not defined by an action, but we are starting to call out those actions.
Yeah, there's been a lot of calls over the years for calling out people who commit acts of violence, commit crimes in rural Alaska, engage in abuse. But one of the voices that we haven't heard from until yesterday, until Thursday afternoon on the floor was the male voice in the Alaska Native community. And what happens to survivors of abuse who are men. And so we did get to talk. Later I talked with a man. His name's Wally Gust. He's from Nootsuyahock. And he did get up and speak before a couple hundred people about his experience.
And we speak of women being hurt by men. I'm coming out of my comfort zone to say it. What about us men who've been hurt when we were younger? Yeah. Don't you think that's the driving force of what we've become? Us men. I know I'm not the only man that's been hurt by an older person. You know? I know I've been hurt physically. That's easy to talk about. But what I'm getting at is the sexual stuff. You know, I've been hurt. And I've carried this on because I've been told not to talk about it. And I thank you, I commend you that even us men have to come out and start working together if we're going to help our youth.
The ability to share your voice and your experiences is something that brings us together. Silencing a voice, regardless of wherever it comes from, is something that doesn't help expand, it diminishes. And we're starting to see the fruits of this open discussion of some very difficult and terrible things. And again, how healing and inspiring it is, and unifying of the people coming together. Yeah,
to me, this moment very much stood out. It was one of those AFN moments that I think, we're talking about the Tanana kids 6 years later. I think we'll be talking about Nootsuyahock's Wally Gust 6 years from now. The courage he had to get up in front of all these people and speak like that. I did manage to grab him afterwards and sort of pick his brain. This was not planned. I talked to some other leadership with AFN. Co-chair Will Mayo told me yesterday he thought that this testimony was groundbreaking. And so we're starting to see these conversations come to the forefront and to break open. And so we'll see where it goes from here.
Very excited to see the healing that'll happen.
Yeah, and you talked about visibility earlier and representation. And one of the things that's happened since last year, actually, elders and youth started using, they would divide people into houses. And so there was a men's house and there was a women's house. And last year, I believe, was the first time that they started creating a LGBTQ and Two-Spirit house for people to be able to go into and have a discussion. And so you're able to have younger people who maybe are a little bit more aware, conscious, and maybe a little bit more proud of who they are. And you have some elders who probably also have some of those feelings and have that dialogue and create that discussion back and forth on that. You're seeing a lot in the lower 48 where LGBTQ natives, sometimes are referred to, and I affectionately refer to myself as an indigiqueer. Those conversations are happening, and it's creating a space for people to be able to come out, have healing, have a community, and have that support that's so desperately needed in a lot of Indian country and Alaska Native communities. So creating spaces for that allows for those dialogues to happen and that healing to begin, and to recognize how a lot of these concepts of like a gender binary being man or woman, there are a lot of tribes in the lower 48, and I speculate that there were a lot of people in Alaska before colonization and churches came in and started putting rules in place, that there are probably a lot more people who identify that the way they are. We're just seeing it more. And so this concept of being new is probably not accurate. It's probably been something that's been going throughout the indigenous community for thousands of years.
Well, individuality doesn't have a time frame nor a time space, and it's something in which Native communities do have in common, is that a artificial time, place, and time reference has been placed on there, and that's something in which we're emerging from within the Native community, reclaiming languages, reclaiming identity, reclaiming culture in the ability to handle difficult situations, and also with differing governments that's going on. And that's one of the beauties of AFN. You are listening to the live coverage of the Alaska Federation of Natives Convention. We'd like to say a special thank you to our listeners tuned in throughout the state in KOTZ Kotzebue, KYUK Bethel, KZPA in Fort Yukon, and KRFF in Fairbanks, Alaska. And so, Emily, what were some of the other insights and things that are happening that have been going on?
You know, I really think that this idea of reclaiming is very interesting and like bringing attention to. And one of the things that we've been looking at for 2 days is this giant cussbuck with all these women's faces drawn on it with Sharpie. And that was created by Alaska Native artist Amber Webb. And
Nation.
right. And, you know, she kind of gave us her sense of this cussbuck's been showing up for, 2 or 3 years now, Tripp? And you were able to catch up with her and talk to her a little bit about it.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen it before, I'm really in awe whenever I see this thing. This thing is massive. It's 12 foot tall, and the portraits on this thing are life-size. So you are literally looking at the faces of 200 and some indigenous people who have gone missing or murdered. And one of the things that when I was talking with Amber about is making sure that trans women, transgender people sort of get that same recognition. And I talked a little bit about that with her.
What I've seen a big part of that identity is being accepted as a woman, and I don't want to single them out on the project because I want them to just be a part of this womanhood that we all experience. And I don't know if I'm going about that the right way, but they're just on there. They're on there. There's only 2 right now, but there's a couple of more in the works. I don't separate that. I don't draw a line between, because as far as I'm concerned, they're women, I'm a woman, the rest of the women on there are women. And that's how I see it. So,
yeah, that's again another beautiful perspective on inclusion. And inclusion just doesn't mean, you're going to be allowed to sit at the table in the corner. It's no, you are included, you are a part, you are seen.
Yeah, and Amber was really clear about having the space where the cussbuck is holding that space for the missing and murdered people who are on it, giving them a sense of presence almost. And we had a really nice long conversation about it, and it was really great. It's like inviting those spirits back in and making them a part of the community and giving them that visibility.
Not forgotten.
Yeah.
She also talked to you, Tripp, about the more serious side of the numbers of indigenous people that are going missing and are murdered, and, cold cases that aren't solved. And she mentioned that she used the word genocide, which I think is really strong language.
like, the entire issue is it's ongoing genocide. It's ongoing genocide. And if it's really hard to try to go about healing that rift in a way that doesn't further separate people, when sometimes it feels like you can't tell the whole truth and have people accept it, but you need to tell the whole truth, and that is the truth. Our women are dying of racism, and then they're further having to suffer that indignity after they die. And it's with these 2 recent cases, I feel like within a group consciousness in the state, like a resounding, like, heartbreak. I don't know how to describe it. It's like spiritually, we're tired. We're tired of defending our women. We're tired of asking people to see us as people, and then tired of navigating microaggressions. And
that idea of genocide, we've seen Canada declare, use the language genocide to describe what has happened to First Nations people in Canada. And I wonder if that's not where this conversation is going. And I would not be surprised to, see organizations like AFN start to use that language to describe what's going on with Alaska Native people, what has gone on with Alaska Native people in a more formal way in the future.
Well, it certainly highlights the rawness and the emotion that happens with such traumatic events like this. I mean, National Native News did a story on the Nome lack of action on their own populace of Native women being assaulted, being murdered, and not a follow-up by the police department there, nor the city. And what Amber was saying there is just feeling tired, feeling disheartened is on top of the mourning and the grief and the hurt. Certainly is a taxing and very wearing emotion to keep going.
And then the reporting aspect of it too, for if you're not from that community, I'm going to say it, if you're white or you're from the lower 48 and you come into the state and you're reporting on it, there's a cultural sensitivity there that often isn't shared. And so there are a lot of times when reporting on big issues, sexual abuse, violence, things like that, there can be sort of a disconnect in there. And a lot of that can come over into the reporting. And there's a recent article that came out about an Eek woman who was killed in Anchorage. And there were some details in that story that, reading it from an Indigenous perspective, I would have never put some of that information in there. You're sort of dragging the victim back through a lot of dirt and mud and filth that probably didn't need to be in that story. I mean, it was a case about
highlighting the entire wrong issues for something that had happened.
Yeah,
right, and that's something in which. Go ahead,
it actually gets to a good point about what's going on here at AFN. If you look at the number of resolutions that have been put forward as drafts under health, safety, and welfare, 40% of those resolutions address public safety and issues of abuse and these kinds of violent crimes in rural Alaska in some way. And that is also the conversation that we're hearing in caucus rooms, too, is that, what it's going to take is dollars on the ground to be able to address these issues. And you are seeing like a big effort to really hammer home to people who maybe are either non-native or not familiar with the reality of what's happening in rural Alaska, that this is what's happening, this is what's having the deepest effects in these communities, and this is what people are getting fired up about.
And I think there's some creative solutions coming out of rural Alaska. I talked with Acha Kasmirov from Kotzebue. She's originally from Mnemonic. She's a longtime public safety expert. She worked in juvenile justice for 20-plus years. She was a VPSO and a Mnemonic for a while. And now she was recently named in March as the public safety officer in the Northwest Arctic Borough. And so for her, and she's an amazing woman, very bright, bubbly personality, and she was so happy to share with some potential solutions that she's looking at to sort of change that perspective on public safety in Alaska. And that's sort of looking at the community and sort of trying to help those VPSOs, those village public safety officers, have some downtime and some time that they can step away from the job a little bit and decompress, because you're seeing a lot of behavioral health come out of that. But we have a clip about Acha's goals that she has for her VPSOs.
Let's turn to those. I want to hear that.
What we need to do is to go back to how we used to police ourselves, but enhance it in a way that's going to be modern for today's use. And the other thing we need to do, once we get some people hired into the positions of our village public safety officers or village police officers, is to set up a support system for them. You hired a village police officer or public safety officer, and you use the people within the community to support them to be able to release some of their frustrations, be able to go to a place where they could have a safe place to just be themselves in normal, whatever normal is, and then not be in the mode of law enforcement all the time.
You know, that reminds me of a comment during day one's afternoon session when they were talking public safety. A community member came up to the microphone and said, when law enforcement comes to follow up on whichever incident is happening, talk to the entire village. That's the opportunity to gather information, not just the person who's experiencing something, because they may not be in a place to talk about it or just unable to. And so I find that very hard.
Yeah, and I really liked my conversation with Acha because she comes from a VPSO standpoint. She told me a story about one time she had to go arrest her auntie who is illegally importing booze into the village, and then they had to go before her other auntie who is the magistrate. So in rural Alaska, you really see this very tight-knit community who have to deal with each other in a way that they have to police each other, and that's to credit to Acha's point. And I think it's really important for communities to be able to come here to AFN and have that dialogue, because we look at different communities, different regions as monoliths that, you know, they're not sharing the same problems that everybody else is. But if you look at rural Alaska, a lot of those problems are getting shared. And we have another area. We were talking to the Association for Village Council Presidents, Village Council Presidents.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
That's it.
I've got so many acronyms in my head right now that it's hard to keep them straight. But
Welcome
we talked
to rural Alaska.
Yeah, right. But I talked to Martha Whitman-Kasich about some. I did not actually. Christy Schellenberger, our collaboration partner from KYUK, got to talk to Martha about some of the things that they're looking for and trying to get the right applicants, the qualified applicants, to apply for those VPSO jobs.
We're very, very culturally rich, and we have a very strong people that just don't have the resources to provide basic public safety for themselves. We just don't have enough qualified applicants. We need qualified applicants to place people, and we want those applicants to be from our communities to serve their people. In my opinion, it is one of the most important factors, because having a VPSO from the community, they understand the people who live there, they know them, they know the challenges of the community, they know the dynamics of the community. They might have a better sense of who are the troublemakers or who have resources to get help and who don't. Troublemakers or who have resources to get help and who don't.
So again, I mean, you're just highlighting the importance of having the Native perspective in whichever avenue that discussion is being had is so important. And whether it's being reported on, whether it's law enforcement stepping in, having that Native perspective and the local perspective is going to be what's most paramount.
Well, and that's part of the conversation that we're also hearing a lot more of. Last year on the agenda, there was a resolution about law enforcement receiving cultural sensitivity training for when they are spending time in villages and they are responding to issues that arise in the villages, and that idea of modernizing the method. There's another resolution this year that talks about amending grant applications from the Department of Justice to reflect an Alaskan reality. And it really talks about the unique nature of Alaska's tribal government structure, and what tribal consortiums are, and better understanding things like the high cost of living and the lifestyle in rural Alaska, so that these issues can be more thoroughly addressed.
Yeah, and I think it's it's to the point we can get back to today where we talk a little bit about that communication between tribal organizations, village corporations, Native corporations, and having that dialogue with state and federal policymakers. You have some? And so that's a big part of what this convention is it is talking about different issues between different regions, different peoples, and elevating those conversations to state politics and Juneau, and also on the federal level in Washington, D.C. And so we had a panel about the education and working towards trying to build a better education system. And at the root of all of this is sort of like trying to allow Alaska Native people to have sovereignty in a lot of the issues that they're having. And one of those issues it came up yesterday, day one, of Governor Mike Dunleavy, when he addressed the delegates, talked about introducing a measure into the legislation next session that would formally recognize tribal authority over educating their members, so allowing tribes again to have that authority to direct their own education programs, to direct their own health programs, things of this nature, giving that sovereignty back to Alaska Natives. Kirsty Schellenberger from KYUK managed to get a hold of Tiffany Zukolski earlier about the work that she wants to see happen at the state level on tribal compacting.
Speaking for myself as a legislator, I will take the governor up on his commitment to working with tribes to do tribal compacting in the area of education. I think it's awesome and a step in the right direction to talk about expanding the role of tribal compacting within the state of Alaska. But I think it's really important that it's not just cost shifting, and it's not just putting the burden of providing state services onto communities or tribes or nonprofits, because as we've seen with the Tribal Child Welfare Compact, there are resources that need to be infused within these agreements. So the state of Alaska needs to provide the resources for the tribal co-signers to be able to actually implement the work.
And you just heard Tiffany Zukolski essentially picking up the gauntlet that Dunleavy put down at his address to the delegates yesterday about that legislation to push forward tribal compacting through education. And, Tiffany's on her second year, I believe, in the state legislature. It's first year with the tribal committee that she's chair of. And so she's really at the forefront of being able to help see a lot of these measures move from Alaska Native communities into state politics.
And that's one of the beauties of AFN and why we're gathered here. We're grateful for you joining in and listening to us and the coverage of AFN. On day two, the morning session, there were several panel speakers talking about investing in our future, protecting our future, all geared towards the future. In the first section, they were talking about the importance of the state's responsibility for public education and infusing Alaskan Native perspective into that. And then also in protecting our future, the importance of the responsibility of the state for public health. And then the public welfare, working with Native corporations to ensuring and working with the state on that. And one of the interesting aspects of that was as soon as these panel discussions were finishing up is when it was pointed out that former Governor Bill Walker was instrumental in bringing these panels together and having this discussion. And what was even more interesting was the juxtaposition of the introductions or the recognition of our former state governor and our current state governor from yesterday. Yesterday, when Governor Dunleavy was introduced, there was silence for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, like yesterday, Governor Dunleavy gave his comments and his prepared, statement, and then left town. Governor Walker's here today, and he's walking around holding and kissing babies and taking selfies with people. It's a very different feeling, for
he
sure.
Was very warmly received here. As soon as it was pointed out and where he was seated in the bleachers, he was seated up in the bleachers, not anywhere near the spotlight. He was pointed out, and the place went wild. It was very well welcomed. And so, folks, it's just an amazing, fun AFN. Thanks for joining us.